Hmm. Hmm.
All right, so we're going into what's called the Genome Project. What is the Genome Project? The, the Genome Project, the genome is a complete set of DNA in an organism. It contains all the information needed for an organism to develop. Now, in common language, we just use the word gene. In scientific arenas, they use the word genome. So I just want you to know that it is the same word as you've been using genes, right? Another name for an aspect of the genes is called DNA, otherwise called deoxyribonucleic acids. It's a molecule that contains genetic information that's unique to each person. DNA is the hereditary material in humans and most other organisms. The Human Genome Project, HGP. The Human Genome Project was a 13-year international research project that ran from 1990 to 2003. The project's goal was to identify, map, and sequence all the genes in the human genome. The project also aimed to determine the base pairs that make up human DNA. The Human Genome Project led to the development of the haplotype map, also known as HapMap. HapMap is a tool that helps researchers identify genes and genetics variations that affect health and disease. What is a haplo? You probably asked. A haplotype is a group of alleles. Alleles means of various variations of a gene in an organism that are inherited together from a single parent. And a haplogroup from haplo, the Greek meaning one-fold or simple, in English is a group of similar haplotypes that share a common ancestor with a single nucleotide polymorphism mutation. Nucleotide polymorphisms are the most common types of genetic variations among people. Nucleus, you see the word nucleus in here? So it's pertaining to the genes inside the nucleus. Poly means many, morphism, morph means changes, right? This is a Greek word that they put together in order to express this process. Polymorphism only means many changes. Nucleotide means that is many changes to the nucleus. That's why they use the phrase nucleotide polymorphisms are the most common types of genetic variation among people. Here on the right, we have a picture of the migration. We will have a larger picture of it later on in this presentation. This is called the HGP migration map. You can find these on the internet by just typing in migration map. What are haplogroups? Remember, the word haplo is a Greek word that just means simple. Okay, so what are the simple groups? Haplogroups or the simple groups are genetic classifications or ancestral groupings within a population, typically defined by shared inherited genetic markers or And I just want to let you know this is one of their scientific words, even though we use it derogatorily. Inherited genetic markers or mutations, meaning mutations in the genes. These markers are passed down from a common ancestor, right? These gene variations are passed down from a common ancestor. They can be traced through the analysis of mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondrial DNA are the materials of the haplogroup and the Y chromosomes of the paternal haplogroup. Mitochondrial DNA is the DNA that is given to the child from the female. The Y chromosome is given to the child from the male. The haplogroups provide insight into human populations, historical migrations, and evolutionary history, helping researchers and genealogists understand the genetic relationship and ancestral origins of individuals and groups. Every modern ancestor's origins can be traced back to Africa. We've heard this in the public information. This is the study that came up with this phrase that every modern ancestor's origins can be traced back to Africa. They figured this out by studying the ancestral haplogroups. So with Homo sapiens, which we call the humans of today, found in Africa's Great Rift Valley about 200,000 years ago. All humans share a common direct maternal ancestor known as mitochondrial DNA Eve. You see, they always tend to use their Abrahamic philosophy to add on to their scientific research. So, since everybody knows the story of Eve, they called this particular haplogroup, gene group, the mitochondrial Eve, meaning the oldest woman that they can trace all humans back to is in the Great Rift Valley, that's Central Africa on the eastern coast. What is mitochondria?
Similarly, in our cells, for the organelles to work, there has to be a continuous supply of energy. So which organelle takes the responsibility of supplying this energy? It's the mitochondria. The double membrane organelle is called as a powerhouse of the cell because it produces molecules which are usable form of energy for the cell.
Another analogy that I've heard for the mitochondria, which might help to put it into perspective, it is called the kitchen of the cell, sometimes called the mother of the cell. Okay. Mitochondrial Eve is believed to be a part of a small group of humans who lived in Africa around the time of the Indultu skull. That's a skull that they found that is 160,000 years old. The word Indultu means firstborn. Mitochondrial DNA found in our cells is the genetic signature that has been passed from mother to child. Just to let you know, mitochondrial DNA only gets passed from the mother to the child, not from the father. That's why they're able to trace it all the way back to Black African women in Central Africa that all humans on the planet are derived from. So far, they've only been able to trace it back to 200,000 years ago. Later on, they may find older bones with the same mitochondrial DNA markers. So the Mitochondrial Eve was a woman who lived about 200,000 years ago, who had enough daughters in a continuous clan that her mitochondrial DNA survived. Sometimes this word is shortened to mtDNA. Homo sapiens eventually migrated across the African continent around 120,000 years ago. It is only between 80,000 to 50,000 years ago that some common ancestors began to leave the continent and spread our kind across the rest of the world. You will find, I will show you in other slides that who these people were according to their studies of genetic mutation. They find that the stabilized genetic mutation that created leucoderms only came about 6,000 years ago. So anything you see 120,000, 80,000, 50,000, they're all talking about Black people, no matter where they are on the planet, because the leucoderms had not mutated yet. So mtDNA, remember that mtDNA refers to the original Black woman that they can trace all human beings back to. mtDNA, Mitochondrial Eve.
Humans inherit mitochondrial DNA only from the mother. So, in order to pass on mtDNA from generation to generation, the mother must have an unbroken link of female descendants. Unlike nuclear DNA, which undergoes recombination, much of mtDNA is passed from mother to daughter, relatively unchanged. If we take a sample of mtDNA from a population and try to reconstruct their matrilineal ancestry using the very slow mutation rate of mtDNA, we might arrive at a single female common ancestor, a mother whom we can all relate to from our mother's side. This is exactly what Kahn, Stoneking, and Wilson did in 1987 and found out that, in fact, all humans alive today do have a common female ancestor who probably lived about 200,000 years ago in Africa. They named her Mitochondrial Eve. Analogous to this, tracing Y chromosomal DNA, which is only inherited from father to son, points to our common father, Y chromosomal Adam. However, there is no reason to believe that Mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosomal Adam lived at the same time. Likewise, they were not the only humans living at the time, but their contemporaries failed to produce a direct matrilineal or patrilineal descent. Also, Mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosomal Adam were only the most recent common ancestors. Going back in time, we can even find common ancestors of species all the way back to the first single-celled organisms. What's more, our actual common ancestor following both mother's and father's side probably lived as early as 5,000 to 10,000 years ago. All this shows that we are so closely related, more so than we could ever imagine.
Is it?
I'm not hearing anything. Is something going on? I can't hear.
Okay, that's what I was wondering. Okay.
Okay.
All right. I'm sorry.
There
Sorry
you
about
go.
that. Sorry about that. Okay. Now, what I want to share is that in some parts of Africa, Africa is a huge continent, 4 or 5 times bigger than the United States, and bigger than Russia, and bigger than China. It's the largest continent on the planet. Among some of the natives on the continent, they would have the inheritance, whether it's physical or spiritual, would only go through the mother's children. Now, in modern science, we now can understand why, because we knew that the bloodline can be traced through the mother. So in some polygamous societies where the man will have more than one wife, the children of a particular wife would take on her last name, not the father's last name. In the kingship role, the kings are not produced from the father like it is in Europe. The king is the son of the mother, that is the bloodline of the family clan. Okay. Most times the king's mother would have been trained before her mother gave birth to her. We call it today prenatal care. Everything that happens to the woman while the child is in her womb affects the child in its growth. So we, knowing that the family line goes through the woman, we prepared this young lady not to be the mother of the king, but to be the mother of the king. The mother of the king becomes the queen mother, not his wife. She is actually the mother of the king. She is the only one that has jurisdiction over the king. If she doesn't like what he has put into law, she's probably not going to do it in public. She will do it in private, but she will pull his coattail to something and then let him come out to the public to make the changes so that the public will feel that it's his idea, but it was the queen mother's idea. Every single king in Kemet only became the king because he married into the royal bloodline. The Western cultures don't talk about the wives as much as they should, but they are just as important, if not more important, than the king. So we have an understanding of what mitochondrial DNA is. You can just raise your hand. You don't have to say anything or just type in the box. Mitochondrial DNA found in our cells is the genetic signature that has been passed from mother to daughter. Whenever you hear the term mitochondrial DNA, it refers to the woman's line, not the man. The man's DNA Western culture can only take the male's DNA, meaning that if they wanted to trace my father's DNA line, they can only trace it back like 4 or 5 generations before they can find any traces. But with the woman, it gets passed on through the children into the male children and the female children. So here we have the first mother. She passes on to her daughter, that's in the reddish orange color. The male that marries her, he gets his status because he married her, the bloodline, the royal bloodline. That's why you'll hear in some of his story, they'll talk about they wiped out the whole family line because they know they cannot leave the bloodline alive. They did that with the Russian family. They did it in history with the Arab family that was ruling. The whys of it, you have to study that on your own. So here we have the mother passing it on to her two daughters, who passed it on to her daughters and cousins and further cousins. So here is a diagram just to show you what's inside of us. Okay, on the left-hand side, this is the average, I'll say the average, what we call it, generation every 20 years. We know that some women have children at 16, some women have children at 30. When we round it off, it comes out to about every 20 years. There's another generation. So at the top here, you see one, that would be you, right? You have two sets of genes on the left-hand side. This column is the gene pool. This is your mother and father, right? So 20 years earlier, your mother and father gave birth to you. So they also have what? Two sets of genes each. So this means that not only do you have your mother and father's genes in you, you have your grandmother's and your grandfather's. So if we keep going down 20 years, 40 years, 60 years, down to 600 years, right? 600 years ago would be 31 generations. We have in our gene pool over 1 billion, over 2 billion ancestors in us. This is why I've said before, we are never alone. Even when we think we're alone, we're not alone. This is only 600 years ago. We're not talking about 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000. So in essence, everybody here and everybody that you see, we are all cousins. We don't even know that we're cousins. We're all cousins. We're all one family line. You get the picture? Grand. In his book, Civilization or Barbarism, check onto Diop's. Hold on a second. Okay, yeah, got it. In his book by Sheikh Anta Diop's, which you will have a copy of this when you download the PDF. After the class, I will upload the PDF to the drive. When you get to this point, you can click on the book and you will have access to the book called Civilizations or Barbarism. On page 107, Sheikh Anta Diop says, more precisely in ancient Egyptian, Sent, S-E-N-T, equals sister. In Wolof, which is Sheikh Anta Diop's native language from Senegal, the word Sant is the proper name of a clan which perpetuates the family line and is that of the mother. In other words, the sister of the uncle is the matrilineal system. It is through the sister that rights are transmitted and the race is perpetuated. According to Ibn Battuta, in the 14th century in Mali, men were not named after their fathers. None of them. The man is named after his father, but each traces his genealogy through that of his maternal uncle. Inheritance is collected by the sons of the sister of the deceased to the exclusion of his own son. You see how we set up a cultural representation of the mitochondrial DNA. We may not have known of the word at the time, but we incorporated that science into our linear system. Here is a drawing of Abdullah Muhammad ibn Battuta, born February 24, 1304. Commonly known as Ibn Battuta, was a Maghribi traveler. That's an Arabic word. The word Maghrib, they just added the I onto it because they anglicized it. The word Maghrib is an Arabic word meaning the West, going from Arabia towards the West. So all of northern Africa, the Arabs call it Maghrib, just meaning the West. The Maghrib explorer and scholar, over a period of 30 years from 1925 to 1954, Ibn Battuta visited most of North Africa near the end of his life. He dedicated an account of his journeys titled "A Gift to Those Who Contemplate the Wonders of Cities and the Marvels of Traveling." And if you wanted to read that book, again, you just click on the image in the PDF that you will be getting tonight or tomorrow morning, and you'll be able to download the book right to your computer. Here it is, a painting that I did back in between 2003 and 2007. This painting, I want to ask you, those that are in the group, mitochondrial DNA. This is the skull that they found. They call it the adultu, meaning firstborn skull, that they found in Central Africa. This skull is the fossil skull of a Homo sapien adultu, was discovered in 1997. Have y'all even heard of this? Probably not. Near Herschel, Ethiopia. The skulls are about 160,000 years old. Mind you, I've only found one picture of it, but the article said skulls are 160,000 years old and are considered to be the direct ancestors of modern humans.
Africa's Great Rift Valley. This is where humanity's story most likely begins. Homo sapiens, anatomically modern humans, have lived here for about 200,000 years. This great geological fault, stretching 3,000 miles through Africa, from Ethiopia to Malawi, with its Great Lakes and savannas full of animal life, gave our ancestors the perfect environment in which to evolve.
The Rift Valley, it's like a crucible, like in a chemistry lab, where humans have been tested. Because nature constantly tests different varieties of a species. Those who can fit the environment or the situation that is around survive and continue, and the others, get replaced.
In 1997, the rains fell heavily in Ethiopia's northern Rift Valley. Layers of sediment dislodged, revealing an extraordinary find, a human skull. It's one of the oldest Homo sapien remains to be found anywhere in the world. Scientists named the skull Idaltu, meaning firstborn, and Idaltu walked these valleys 160,000 years ago. Dr. Berhane Asfal was one of the scientists who made the discovery.
This is one of the few specimens that we found almost complete, called the face and the brain case. And the most impressive thing about this is even at this early age, the face is modern Homo sapien, the brain case is modern Homo sapien, the shape from the back is a modern Homo sapien. It's exactly us.
The anatomy and age of Adultu's skull provided the strongest evidence yet that anatomically modern humans emerged in Africa.
In each stage of the evolution toward modern humans, it takes place in Africa.
When we found Homo sapien adultu, it was very important because it pushes the time far back. That means anatomically modern Homo sapiens started walking on this planet much earlier than we thought. And the interesting thing is, at the same time, Europe was packed with Neanderthals, which are completely different from Homo sapiens.
One of Africa's most respected paleoanthropologists is Dr. Richard Leakey. He and his colleagues have made groundbreaking discoveries about how our species evolved on the African continent. I've come to meet him at his institute in Nairobi, Kenya. How do we know that the first human beings evolved on the African continent?
The fossil evidence and the archaeological evidence that's come to light in the last 20, 30 years is very, very substantial, testable, and real.
Why do you think this idea was so disturbing in some quarters?
Historically, the science of paleoanthropology or anthropology came into existence at a time when we really knew very little. Africans were considered primitive, heathen, who knows?
In the origins of the subhuman status of Africans begins really in the 18th century, in the Enlightenment, ironically enough.
Yeah, they weren't really considered to be one of our species.
Continuing archaeological finds and now major scientific breakthroughs have confirmed that Africa absolutely was the cradle of humanity.
It's like if we were exploring our past and looking at where our roots are sunk down, we'll find that they're the deepest in Africa, and that's where we get most of our genetics.
Geneticists have identified an astonishing link to our earliest human relations through our DNA. Every living person shares a common direct maternal ancestor. She's known as Mitochondrial Eve. We believe that she was part of a small group of humans who lived in this region of Africa around the time of the Adultu skull.
Our common ancestry through the Mitochondrial Eve means that our genetic differences are literally skin deep, that at the bottom we are all descended from the same family.
Mitochondrial DNA, found in our cells, is the genetic signature passed down through females from mother to child. What it means is that this was a woman, hypothetically, who lived 200,000 years ago, who had enough daughters in a continuous chain, straight back so that her mitochondrial DNA survived.
Absolutely right.
And all of us today, no matter what we look like, are descended from black ancestors?
Yeah, that is exactly. That's what happened. All the humans, all the Homo sapiens all over the world, be it yellow, white, black, we are all descended from a common ancestor in Africa.
What would life for human beings 200,000 years ago have been like in this valley?
200,000 years ago, I would imagine, the groups were quite small.
Mm-hmm.
The dangers around, we had predators, things like hyenas and groups of carnivores all around.
Mm-hmm. It's difficult for us to imagine prehistoric life or a world without any trappings of the things that have come to define humanness over the last 10,000 years. And so in the modern zeitgeist, the only thing that comes close is actually the post-apocalyptic zombie shows, for example. You have small bands of people roaming the landscape, working together, fighting off predators that are trying to eat them, and worried about the other groups of humans that they might bump into. So there are a lot of interesting parallels that could be drawn.
Modern Homo sapiens initially lived only in Africa, slowly spreading across the continent over 120,000 years. But between 80 and 50,000 years ago, they began successfully to populate the rest of the world. So what happened 80,000 years ago?
Well, I wish we knew what happened, but there's no doubt at all that a very small population somewhere in that time zone got some adaptation that gave them a huge advantage. I have a feeling it might have been speech. I don't know what it was. But they spread very quickly out of Africa.
So 80,000 years ago, the human community was black?
Wherever they were in the world.
But when those early human beings migrated out of Africa, they weren't traveling alone. They were carrying something within them. And that something had developed slowly over millennia. It was culture. That culture would develop to include the greatest achievements of human creativity. And it began here on the African continent.
In 1991, archaeologist Christopher Henshelwood, exploring his grandfather's land, discovered the opening to a cave on a cliff face above the crashing waves where the Atlantic and Indian Oceans collide. Today, we call this the Blombos Cave. Inside is evidence of over 140,000 years of human habitation and signs of the first form of human creative expression. Before this discovery, we thought the earliest examples of artwork were found in the Lascaux caves in France, dating back only 35,000 years ago.
When people began making discoveries in southern Africa, like at Blombos Cave, they realized that actually this record of artistic production goes back much further than anyone guessed. In France, cave paintings 30,000 years old, 35,000 at the oldest. In southern Africa, we're talking about 90,000, 100,000 years.
The Blombos Cave is a relatively recent discovery. So the more research we do in Africa, and also the more dating we conduct, this will change people's minds of how we saw human history. And the evidence shows they were already possessing the cognitive behavior that we see as defining the modern human before they left Africa.